So you're all dying to go into the wards and actually start taking care of patients. You watched all these movies and films, like whether it's MBBS or 3 Idiots, where you actually make a difference to a patient's life, you save a patient's life, you're in the middle of the surgery, right? All of us have these dreams. That's the reason why we became doctors in the first place. Part of the tragedy, of course, is you're going to be stuck for the first year sitting in lecture halls like this, listening to lectures. But there's a reason actually for that. And because the reality is, no matter how successful you've been as students so far, no matter how successful you've been in scoring when you went your exams, actually taking care of patients is a completely different cup of tea. Which is why often you're going to find yourself like this poor little child. You've been thrown into the swimming pool, all you have is some floats, and you need to figure out the way for yourself. And the reality is that every doctor, this is the biggest fear we all have. You're going to mess up, you're going to make a mistake. And it's sometimes not you who makes the mistake, it's a junior who makes a mistake, or someone else, maybe it's a nurse, maybe it's your colleague, and then what happens? Then you get stuck. And this is what we need to keep on emphasizing. And this is something which happens all the time. It's not just doctors who are scared of making mistakes. Patients are extremely scared. Oh, will the doctor give me the right injection? Will the doctor write the right prescription? Is this the right doctor for me? And that's what I'm going to talk about. The first rule of medicine, as we all know, is called first do no harm, or primum non nocere. This is something which you'll come across in all your textbooks. Because the fact of the matter is that as doctors, you're extremely powerful. There's a lot of good which you can do, but you can never just do good without also potentially doing harm. And part of the problem, of course, is that to err is human. We all know that. And that's why the saying is to err is human, to forgive divine. But trust me, if you mess up with a patient's life, no one is going to forgive you. And the problem is that when you make mistakes and you err, these errors cause harm. Everyone makes mistakes, but for example, if a clerk makes a mistake, that's usually easily rectifiable. When a doctor makes a mistake, as a result of which either a patient dies or a patient loses his eyes or something else, that's not so easy to forgive. And that's where the tension in the room is. We all love tables, right? We all love classifications. You remember all your Venn diagrams? But you've forgotten everything. Now that you've gotten to JJ, why do you need to care, right? This is always the problem. By the time I finished my 7th standard, by the time I got into the 8th standard, I'd forgotten everything they taught me in the 7th, right? After you've finished an exam, who cares who the capital of Estonia is, or where you can find Paraguay on the map? It doesn't matter anymore. But the reality is that doesn't happen in medicine. In medicine, no patient is going to come and say, hey, this is the chapter you need to read, or this is what you need to know. Because any patient can come with any problem, and they don't come neatly slotted, or have a neurological problem or a cardiological problem. And that's exactly why all healthcare encounters, hopefully most of them will be fine, so there will be no errors. But within some of them, there will. And a lot of these errors, because you're not doing this alone, you're working as a team, someone else will catch that error and prevent that error from causing any harm. So even if you made a mistake and it doesn't cause harm, that's called a near miss, which means no harm was done. But you can learn a lot from those near misses because you were lucky that time, but there's no certainty you'll be lucky every time. But along with those, they are called adverse events. By hiding the truth. And the general attitude for most doctors is, as the slide says, is a lot of doctors especially start thinking, I am perfect. Literally, can anyone read what the slide says? Effectively, it says, I'm not playing God, I am God. And a lot of doctors, because let's be honest, by the time you've been a doctor for 20 years, you have this gaggle of medical students, nurses, juniors, assistants. You have an OPD full of 100 patients. Every time you walk into the OPD, everyone respects you, salutes. So you think, I am God, I've saved so many lives. And sometimes that goes to doctors' heads. And then instead of being humble and saying, yes, there was a problem, doctors start becoming arrogant. And patients and relatives definitely don't like that. And that's when the problem occurs. We all love acronyms, right? Yes or no? How many acronyms do you remember? You tell me. Do you know what an acronym is? Sorry? Perfect. So that's the acronym. What's the difference in an acronym and a mnemonic? Does anyone know what a mnemonic is? So, I'll tell you one thing. the reason you will find medicine fascinating is try to understand where the words come from. Every word has a history. It has a root. And if you understand the root of the word and where it's coming from, a lot of this stuff will stick into your brain, because the reality is in the beginning, there are so many new words you need to learn all the time that it's extremely hard. But if these words hook onto something which you already know, it'll be easier. And a mnemonic is just something which helps you to remember. And that's what assist is. What does that mean? It means automate whenever possible. Because if you're automating stuff, the element of human error goes down a little bit. When you standardizes, this is what are called SOPs, or standard operating procedures. Everyone knows what needs to be done. So you don't have to depend on an individual to come up with an immediate recipe. What does simplify mean? The more the complicated things are, the more the scope for errors. If it's basically just step number 1, step number 2, step number 3, and everyone's following the same steps, it's going to make life a lot easier. When we say stress the system, what does that mean? It means have dummy runs. It's like a fire alarm, for example. How do you know where your fire extinguishers are working properly or not? Unless you actually have these fire drills to make sure. And sometimes that's helpful. Suppose there was a problem. How would the system react? How would individual people react? So you're stressing the failure points. Keep a safety net. All of us are going to mess up, whether we like it or not. But if you have redundancy, if you have duplication built in, the chance of that error actually causing harm to the patient will be much less. And I'm going to explain that to you. But I think the most important slide is the bottom, is the last line. Ultimately, and this I'm going to keep on coming back to this in my presentation, is that it's not just one person who makes an error. It's one person makes an error when the other 4 people keep quiet. And this is a big problem when it's the senior most person who makes an error. Especially in Indian society, you have these authority gradients. When someone senior makes an error, everyone else keeps quiet, even though you know that he's making a mistake which can cause harm. You need to be able to have the courage to speak up. You don't have to be rude about it. You can be polite about it. You can say, hey, can you explain why you're doing things? But each of you can actually act as safety nets, and that's a huge opportunity. This is actually why errors occur in a place like JJ Hospital. And you get any US doctor to come to a place like JJ and they just cannot believe that you can actually end up seeing 200 patients within a 2-hour period. And they actually wonder why more patients don't die or why more errors don't occur. Just imagine, look at this poor doctor. That he's surrounded by 6 patients. He's trying to see all these 6 patients at one time. There are relatives, there are peons, there are clerks. The boss is ringing the bell. The poor guy hasn't had time to have a cup of tea. His brain doesn't work. This is a breeding ground for errors. So when errors occur, it's partly because people are overloaded and there's just too many things. Now, in a perfect world, you would have 15 minutes to talk to each individual patient. You would establish rapport. You would establish, कैसे हो आप? आपकी तबीयत ठीक है कि नहीं, मैं आपकी क्या मदद कर सकता हूँ, stuff which I can do in my IVF clinic. Very hard to do in a place like JJ. And not only is it very hard, partly because you're young, you're inexperienced, your workload is much more, your patients are illiterate, your patients are ignorant, therefore your responsibilities also become a lot more. But I'll tell you one thing. If you can survive in a place like JJ Hospital, you'll be able to survive anywhere in the world. You will thrive anywhere in the world if you can survive in a place like JJ Hospital. So count your blessings. It's a stress test, no question about it. But if you do well here, where the equipment doesn't work, where there are too many patients, where there isn't enough time, where the electricity goes away, where the tubes are blocked, where 50 different things which can possibly go wrong, if you can still survive, I think that's great, full marks. But I think this is equally important. It's not just the patient who suffers when there's a medical error. The doctor suffers too. Why did we become doctors? We became doctors, we wanted to help patients. And when either because we mess up or we forgot something or we didn't do something, guys, here's an error coming up. But see, this is a great example. If this flag hadn't come up that your battery is running low, what would have happened? We would have continued giving this presentation, the battery would have run out, the laptop would have died, and none of us would have known what went wrong. And because of the automation system, this is intelligent IT. It's giving you a flag, it's giving you a warning. That's a safety net. And you're seeing it in real life. How do we implement some of these things? Ideally, it should be, you should have, hey, you're not thinking straight because your blood sugar is too low because you haven't had your breakfast. Please go have something so you can start thinking properly. The good thing about the battery running low is my presentation will end. And then you guys will be able to go on and do more interesting things with your life. but I'll continue going till the battery lasts. So, as I said, this is the second victim. And why is that such a problem? Because the first thing anyone does, especially the politicians, especially, I'm sure you've seen enough of these movies. Oh, problem happened, find out the doctor on duty and put that doctor, first suspend the doctor on duty, take away his license, take him to court, file a case against him. Everyone's just looking for these scapegoats. And we've seen that happen so many times. There was this hospital where the oxygen cylinders weren't available, and the oxygen cylinders weren't available. They blame the pediatrician on duty for the babies dying. Or when a fire occurs in a neonatal intensive care, the first thing they do is lock up the dean or the medical superintendent or the pediatrician. Now, is it the pediatrician's job in an intensive care unit to take care of patients? Or is it his job to make sure that the electrical safety lines are working properly or not? This is exactly how irrational the system is. And this is how the system is designed to fail. But the first thing is, once you get a scapegoat, everyone is sorted. And then you punish the poor guy, even though it's no fault. And what happens when you make a mistake? And we're all humans. We all feel, yeah, I could have done something better. I shouldn't have let this happen. So A, you blame yourself. There is this sense of fear. Oh God, will I get punished? Will I get expelled? What are people going to say if this happens? You feel guilty about it. What an idiot I was. How did I let that happen? And trust me, I've made lots of mistakes in my life. And the mistakes which I make in the medical profession cause me far more sleepless nights than the mistakes I do as an angel investor. When I make a mistake as an angel investor, I lose some money. I don't care too much because I know I can always earn that money back again. But if I make a mistake which harms a patient's chance of getting pregnant and she's lost that opportunity, that's really hard to live with. There is that sense of shame. There's a sense of anger with yourself. How could I have been such an idiot? We all have a certain opinion of ourselves, self-esteem that, hey, we're good guys. We got into JJ Hospital. We're good doctors. We're intelligent. We're smart. And yet we allowed the error to occur. Of course, that embarrassment, which is why you try to cover up, it's extremely hard. This is the biggest problem, that sense of depression. And this is why medical students sometimes will end up committing suicide, or they will just drop out of medical college because they just can't handle all the stress and the pressure when something goes wrong, and they blame themselves for it. And of course, our system is not necessarily very generous. It's always, you bloody idiot. You didn't know this, you did this, you should have done this, and you get a dressing down in public, in front of everyone else. You can just imagine what the feelings for that particular person is. So I think my only request is, if this happens to yourself and you made the error, learn to be kind to yourself. And if someone else has made this error, please be kind to that person. No one makes errors deliberately. No one wants errors to happen. And long term, this is what the big issue is. Of course, you're frustrated. You say, I'm never going to do surgery. I'm too clumsy. I'm too this thing. And then you choose another specialty like psychiatry because you're worried about whatever mistakes you made. You're very isolated because whom do you talk to? You feel you're the only person in the world who's made an error, whereas the reality is everyone has. But no one's willing to talk about it because we hide these. And then when you have these sleepless nights, you're always playing back. Suppose if I'd gone 5 minutes earlier. Suppose if I'd phoned my senior a little bit earlier. Suppose I'd asked for help. Suppose, woulda, coulda, shoulda, 50 different things. And nightmares and sleepless nights are common. Trust me about this. There is that sense of grief. You'll always feel, it was because of me that that poor baby didn't survive. Or if I had done this and if I had done that. And we'll all learn to live with this. And the reason I'm telling you this is all part of becoming a doctor. And you can't overlook it. Becoming a doctor is not just a question of learning stuff in a medical book. You first have to be honest with your own feelings, because only if you're honest with your own feelings will you be able to manage other people's feelings. And this is what really makes a difference between a good doctor and a great doctor. A great doctor cares about patients because he answers to his own feelings. He understands that he's not a machine. But of course, not all doctors are good. So some of them will just take this other approach. They'll just refuse to accept the fact that the error occurred, or they'll always blame someone else for it, or they'll just say it wasn't my problem, or someone else should have taken care. Please don't let that happen to you. Because I understand it's a defense mechanism, the denial and the distancing, but you're not helping anyone by using that approach. And I think part of the problem, of course, is that especially in clinical medicine, we're actually taught to be detached. We're taught to be, that's the patient and you're the doctor. But that's not very helpful because you actually have to learn to empathize with the patient. You have to learn to be compassionate. And if something bad happens, I think it should be able to affect your feelings. But part of the problem is we make it very hard in our society for people to ask for help. Don't let that happen. Please, have at least 2 or 3 good friends where you can talk to each other, be open about these things. And if you discuss the near misses, as I explained to you, where something went wrong but didn't harm the patient, because those are much easier to discuss because there's nothing to hide, because nothing went wrong, you'll find it much easier to discuss errors. So what happens when you make an error? Like I said, first be kind to yourself. We all do. Be kind to each other. Don't keep, Arey, if I were in your place, I would have done this, or you're an idiot, or you should have done this. Honestly, that doesn't help anyone. And accept the fact that we are going to make mistakes. So don't try criticizing all the time. But just because you made an error doesn't make you a bad doctor, doesn't make you a bad person. In fact, the only time you can make an error is when you actually try to help someone else. I mean, if you don't want to make errors, what's the best thing to do? Who do I? Who's sleeping here? Whoever's sleeping, put up the hands. No, sorry. Okay, whoever's sleeping next to you, put up the hand, and I'll ask that person. No, okay. So the best way to not make an error is to sit locked up in your room. You know, you sit locked up in your room and you answer all the multiple choice questions they're going to ask you on your NEET or your PG NEET or your next exam or whatever else. It doesn't matter if you make an error on an MCQ, does it? What will happen? At the most, you won't get into the seat. But that's a great way of protecting. Yourself. But if you do go out and you want to treat patients, you will make errors, trust me. And failure is inevitable. I mean, that's just accept that. That's part of living. And therefore, you need to minimize the risks of that happening and learn to deal with it. If you want to heal, you need emotional support, which you need to provide for yourself. And the most important thing is you need to bounce back. This is not going to be the first error you're going to make in your life. You made lots of them. But trust me, this is not going to be the last error either. I make errors, I make mistakes, I try to prevent them from happening a second time. But the only way I can prevent them from happening is by first acknowledging that they occurred. And ultimately, it's my clinic. So even if my nurse messes up, it's still my responsibility. I cannot pass the buck on to her. I can't shout at her. I can't blame her. I have to make sure that that doesn't happen a second time. Lots of great books. A lot of these books are available at the health library. It's fairly close by. It's just at the other end of Bombay Central Bridge. And that's called Learning to be Resilient and what you can do to prevent yourself from becoming the second victim. That's where the library is. I think this is an important concept. It's a very foreign concept to India, where we read about things like culture, but we don't really understand what good culture is. And what is positive safety culture? There are four elements. One is an open culture, where you don't try to hide things. You're willing to discuss it. You're willing to be open about it. Yes, things happen. Why are you willing to be open in your house? Because you know that even if you make a mistake, your mother will forgive you. She's not going to kick you out of the house. Oh, you didn't have your breakfast. You're a stupid child. Get out and never come back again. You know that you will have that forgiveness element. And that's what allows you to be open about it. Again, don't try to pinpoint the blame on an individual person. There's no point in asking who was responsible. The reality is, if you were in that position, you would most probably have made exactly that same mistake because the system was designed to make that mistake. Ask what is responsible. What does just culture mean? There's no point in punishing people. And that's the big problem with the Indian judicial system. You know, punishing the doctor is not going to give that patient their eyesight again. And if he did mess up, then really you've not served any purpose. But what lesson are you giving the 100 other doctors? That, hey, learn to practice defensive medicine, over-order tests, do a lot of unnecessary things. Get 50 different consultations so you can distribute whatever happens. So if something goes wrong, you're not held responsible anymore. And that's the difference between restorative justice. And often if something goes wrong, all patients want is honesty. Yes, I'm sorry, I really feel bad that this happened to you. This is the reason it happened. This is what went wrong. And patients are willing to be forgiving, trust me. They will not forgive you if you hide from them. They will not forgive you if you lie to them. But otherwise, they also understand that you're a human being doing their best just like they are. So I think this whole attitude of punishing people when an error occurs is not healthy. A reporting culture, because unless you report errors, how will we ever learn from them? And a learning culture. This is really important. You're privileged to be students because you're privileged to learn. But your learning doesn't stop once you graduate from JJ. Actually, your learning starts once you graduate from JJ. All we're trying to do is provide you with the foundation, with the background, so that whatever you learn in the future will have a solid background. And therefore, you need to prevent future problems if you learn from them. So those are the things, simple enough. All these are simple words, But honestly, unfortunately, most of these rules are broken. We don't have an open culture, we have a hiding culture. A lot of our culture is unjust. We usually blame the junior most person because the junior most person is defenseless. He can't stand up for himself. We often tend to hide, we don't report, and we fail to learn. We cover up mistakes. So it's all become a negative vicious cycle. And if we follow these, then it's effectively a team so that you don't have to make the mistakes yourself. You learn from other people's mistakes. But if you set it up this way, you'll be able to anticipate what can happen and you'll prevent these errors from happening. Mistakes will happen, but if you design the system so that if it happens, you can recover from it, the patient will not get harmed. And this again is a famous model. It's called the Swiss cheese model. And what does it say? There are multiple barriers built in to prevent harm from occurring to the patient. And these barriers, for example, include the protocols, the SOPs which you have, what we teach you. There will be physical barriers, for example, you can't connect an oxygen tubing to a carbon dioxide cylinder because they won't fit. There will be information, which is what we're trying to teach you, so that you can make the right decisions. Now, if one of those things goes wrong, it doesn't matter because the harm will not reach the patient. If two of those things, because each of these barriers has holes in it, that's why it's called the Swiss cheese model. But God forbid, out of 100 times, all those errors will line up, and that's when the harm will occur to the patient. And that's what we need to try to prevent by creating as many barriers as we can and reducing the number of holes and preventing them from lining up. I think this is important when we talk about the system. What is the blunt end of the system? The blunt end of the system are the politicians who decide how much money will be spent on a place like JJ Hospital. The blunt end of the system is the administration who decides where the money will be spent. Should the money go to patient care or should the money go to, putting up more air-conditioned buildings? Or these are the decisions which are made not by the individual doctor. These are decisions made on a much higher level. But these are the decisions which keep on trickling down. That ideally, if you require 10 intensive care beds, but the government only sanctions 5, and then some politician in the middle siphons the money away, as a result of which there are only 2 beds, what's going to happen to those critically ill patients? No matter, even if you as a doctor are a superhuman, if you don't have the equipment and you don't have the facilities, you're not going to be able to manage. You can't do this single-handed. And this is what happens. This is the sharp end of the system. These are all the human factors. But that's the problem, that you are at the cutting edge and you're at the bleeding edge and you get blamed for everything which happens because you're the one in directly contact with the patient. And when there is a patient bleeding in front of you, you can't blame and say, blood bank doesn't have blood, or they didn't provide enough blood within the blood bank, because the patients are going to get angry and beat up on you if you can't arrange the blood, even though the fact that there wasn't enough blood in the blood bank is not because of what you did. It's because the administration did not provide enough money to make sure that enough bottles of blood were donated to the blood bank that this situation wouldn't arise. Which is why it's so important to step back and look at the big picture and thinking about what can be done to prevent it. I understand there's always going to be this sense of helplessness. What can I do? These are decisions which are made at a much higher level, which is true. But if you understand where this is coming from, hopefully 5 years from now or 10 years from now, when you're in positions of power, you will prevent these same errors from happening. This is a famous fishbone diagram, which again describes the same thing, that errors occur within the system. It's not an individual. It's only when they all line up. There's a problem with the environment. For example, there's a lot of noise going on. There's a lot of crowd. You can't focus on the patient. Your equipment doesn't work properly because no one has bothered to maintain it, and it wasn't maintained because no service contract was signed, and no service contract was signed because the politician did not release the money to JJ Hospital in that particular. You talk to your professors and your teachers and the heart is in the right place and they want to do all the right things, but just to get a simple microscope working in this department, you have to fill 50 files, you have to spend half the time in Sachivalaya. They would much rather be spending the time talking to you and teaching you, but the administration doesn't allow them to do that, and it's extremely sad. Again, with the leadership, now if you're lucky, you have a good leader, a lot of this stuff can change dramatically. But and the trouble, of course, is politicians want to manipulate the stuff, and people don't stay long enough to be able to have an impact because everyone keeps on getting transferred all the time. Very frustrating for everyone. Again, communication, and as I said, the people, the team. If everyone in the team is junior and there is no senior person available during an emergency, what do you think is going to happen? And finally, the procedures. which means if tomorrow you don't have those safety nets built in, you're going to end up with problems. Where does the accountability in a system come from? I think this is a common problem. People say, oh, but if you're going to say it's the system which is to blame, then aren't people going to be accountable? And of course, if people are accountable, but only when they're part of a system. We're not saying, okay, you have shoot to do any error you like just because it was the system. You are a part of the system. The whole point is that we're trying to do it in such a way that we can learn from them to prevent them from happening again. But remember one thing, if you start this blame game and you start blaming people, then that's the first enemy to ever creating safety at all. I think IT is a safeguard, no question about that. You have electronic medical records, you have all these safety things built in so that you can find the information where you want it. For example, there's this drug-drug interaction. How much can you put in your brain? And I think human brains are becoming smaller. Why are human brains becoming smaller? You with the blue mask, anyone? Do you actually think human brains are becoming smaller? Do you think we are more intelligent than you guys because we are older and your brains have shrunk? What do you think? Okay, all right, kidding apart. Okay, so I think the reason, of course, is for a lot of us, all that knowledge is now available in a peripheral brain, which is your smartphone. So you don't need to bother, you don't need to remember anything, you don't need to stress yourself. You just look it up on Google and you find the information. And obviously, the more you look up stuff, the less you store, which can be great if you know what to store and what not to. But sometimes you end up taking these shortcuts, and that's a bit of a problem. Then you don't use your own brains anymore. You're so dependent, and that's a big problem. So just to give you an example, a lot of IT systems these days will have these drug alerts. So that, hey, this particular patient is on warfarin. These particular drugs are contraindicated. So that if by mistake you put in that particular entry, a red flag will come up, just like we saw. And they'll say, no, you need to think about it. And because we're human, we forget. And this is called medication reconciliation. What does that mean? Is that any time a patient is shifted from one place to another, there's something called a handoff, which means the theater staff in the OT or the nursing staff in the intensive care unit is different from the staff in the ward. And unless that communication is seamless, mistakes are going to happen. Here are some of the examples. How do you know which particular patient requires which particular drug? And these are simple things which can be built in. And honestly, I want you to keep your eyes open as medical students. When you're going into a ward, you should think about the 50 different things which are wrong. And don't think you're helpless and powerless. Think about, hey, why can't we fix this particular problem? Or why can't we do it? So just to give you an example, when patients come to JJ, you see them stand in long lines waiting to get into the OPD. But for example, when you go to a 5-star hotel, people don't make you wait in long lines. So how can you treat these JJ hospital patients as respected customers? And how can you use some of this technology to make sure that they don't need to stand in long lines? And a lot of this is available. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Can you have a smart card which uses some of these things? A lot of hospitals have actually started implementing it. So the next time a relative of yours is admitted in a 5-star corporate hospital, think about the procedures the corporate hospital does to make the experience better for the patient, and then think about how you can do some of that stuff. And that's where M.I.C.E labs can come in. You can talk to Dr. Menon. These are actual projects which you can do, which can make a difference to a patient's life in JJ. But like I said, health IT is not a panacea for everything else. You said that. And especially when there are all these multiple monitors, you don't even know what to look at. And if you go to an ICU, nurses are so fed up of things beeping all the time that even when something beeps, they either switch off the alarm, or they don't even know whether it's actually a problem or whether there's something malfunctioning. And this can be a bit of a problem. It causes fatigue. And this is what is called inattentional blindness, which means you're focusing so much on one thing that you forget to look at the big picture. And every once in a while, you need to take a big breath, you need to step back, and you need to look at what's happening. The alarm fatigue I explained. Here's a real life example of what we can do. And these are very common errors which happen on a daily basis. These are IV medication errors. This is one way, right? Which means there's a little IV pouch, the nurse takes an injection, she puts it in the IV pouch and she does it. But lots of errors can occur. And the reason is these are sick patients, they're taking multiple injections, the nurses are busy, she may put the wrong vial in the wrong drug, give it, and all of us know these things happen all the time. By the grace of God, more patients don't end up in problems, but these problems have occurred in the best of hospitals all across the world. Remember that. And a lot of this is when it occurs. People have come up with all kinds of clever solutions. So, for example, when you have manual mixtures, the scope for errors is actually extremely high. What is one way of preventing that? What are called ready to mix, which means this medication is already put in the pouch, which means there's no scope for error. The percentage is right, there's a single drug. All the nurse needs to do is pick up the bag and put it in. A little more expensive, definitely, but reduces the chance of error. And that's where the ready to use finally comes in. So, therefore, there are gradients which are available. In India, a big problem is we're a poor country. We're always trying to cut corners. We're always trying to create, okay, this is what it is. As a result of which is the poor, overburdened, overloaded nurse who already has 10 patients to take care of. And then instead of making a life easier by giving her ready to use stuff, we make her life harder by making her do all these things which they don't do in other parts of the world. So I'm not saying we're not a poor country. But you know what? We're also a rich country in the form of the brains which you guys bring into this hospital. Can you guys come up with clever solutions which are cheap, which can be easy to implement, which are frugal? And honestly, if you guys don't come up with these solutions, who's going to come up with these solutions? There's not going to be dinosaurs like me. You know, we've been there, done that. So every time you see a problem, think of every challenge as an opportunity. What can we do to fix the problem? And you will see problems all the time. And that's why your ability to come up with solutions is so much better. Here's another example. Simple things. If you notice, all the labels are color coded, which means the chance of making errors is so much. There is all the details, which means, and how do you do this? One nurse fills it, a second nurse checks it. And there are lots of books which are written about, how all this stuff. It's called a checklist. There's a doctor called Dr. Gawande who's written the book. All these things are definitely worthwhile and have been implemented. But have you been to an ICU? How many of you have been into an ICU? Wow, you guys are lucky. No one's ever fallen critically ill. Yeah, I can see some hands. ICUs are scary places. Trust me, this is far more complicated than an aeroplane cabin, for example, or an aeroplane cockpit, where there are just so many dials and there's so many things which can potentially go wrong. Okay, I'm going to give a prize to someone who can answer this question. You want to put up your hands? 5 seconds, 4 seconds. Okay, I completely agree with that. He said it's a blended effort, but that's still not answering my question. Best means only one. Sorry? So I can't hear the word. Okay, I think we're headed there in the right direction, but this is what the answer is. It's the human brain. It's what each of you guys has within you, which each of you guys has, which is special. This is the ultimate defense at multiple levels. It's obviously the defense, as you quite correctly said, when you're actually seeing a patient. But it's also the defense which you guys can come up with clever solutions which will prevent hundreds of other nurses and doctors to make errors if you implement some of this stuff. And I think this is something we need to remember. Humans are actually heroes. It's very tempting to paint them as villains. Oh, the electrical fire occurred because so-and-so didn't do this. The oxygen ran out because so-and-so didn't do this. But humans are actually saving lives every single day. I agree with you that they cause problems, but don't forget, humans provide the solutions. This is where it comes from. And places like JJ Hospital are actually chaotic, whether you like it or not. They have to be, because you're so understaffed, you're so underfunded. Even today, for example, there is a class 4 strike. Now you tell me, even if the doctor is on duty and has the best intentions at heart, if tomorrow there is no ward boy available to move the patient from the ward into the OT, what is the poor surgeon going to do? I'm just trying to explain to you how complex some of these systems are. And in spite of all this, JJ Hospital continues to function. Hats off. And I think it's this human adaptability, the ability to bounce back. I think this is what creates the shields. So you create shields one-on-one on a daily basis, but you also create shields for the future. And that's the opportunity you guys have. I think this is something we need to remind politicians, journalists, patients, judges, that it's the doctors and the nurses. I would love to see a judge actually spend a day in JJ Hospital and then let's see how many mistakes he makes and how many errors he makes. But the problem is when they sit in their air-conditioned ivory towers passing out judgments, they have no clue. Part of the fault is also ours. that we've not bothered to explain to them exactly what's happening. And I think we need to take responsibility for that. But again, work as a team. And trust me, if you're smart, you will learn far more from the nurse who's been working in that ward for 20 years than you will ever learn from your professor. Because your professor will come and your professor will go. But it's that nurse who's taking care of that patient. She knows the patient's name, she knows the patient's relatives, she knows where the. So please respect her, is all I'm trying to say. She'll make your life a lot better. And that's true for ward boys. And this happens all the time. When the doctor can't start an IV, if he's smart, then instead of calling his registrar, who may not be able to start an IV either, the right thing to do is either call a nurse or to call a ward boy. He's seen so many IVs being started that he'll mostly be able to do it in his sleep. The reality is there is a natural tendency for things to go wrong. And this is the problem with safety. No one appreciates when things don't go wrong. We only make a big hoo-ha when things go wrong. But the reality is that safety is dynamic. But it's a non-event, which means you've not allowed that mistake to occur. But it's hard work, trust me, and it never becomes easier. I think this is important. And I think if you learn to respect your patients, you will understand that your best defense is your patient. Now, this is much harder in a place like JJ Hospital, but still very doable. Because fortunately, patients in JJ Hospital have relatives who are educated and literate. They all carry smartphones, or if not smartphones, at least some sort of phones. There are lots of things you can do to educate your patients. And your patients will prevent you from making errors. And if you spend that time and energy, they will teach other patients. As a result of which, all these patients will become the ultimate line of defense. And here's a simple guideline. Again, this is the acronym or the mnemonic: be safe. They tell patients, yes, errors can occur. Hospitals can be dangerous places. Educate the patient. Educate patients that it's okay for them to speak up. Hey, that doesn't seem to be the right injection, or this is not the right time for the injection, or this is not what the doctor says. That patient may sound to be pesky, but ultimately everyone wants the patient to do well. If you speak up, you're allowed to act. And again, the whole point is to become error-free, and it's a joint effort. Nurses can't do it alone. Doctors can't do it alone. We all need to do it together. I know this has been a bit of an information overload, guys. I apologize for that. But, if nothing else, I needed to cover the topics. I don't expect you to remember any of this. Don't worry about it. It's perfectly okay to forget. The point is we're just introducing some of these terms so that you can then go back and read. And there are a couple of suggestions I'm going to give you guys. Every time before you attend a lecture, you know what's going to be covered that day in that particular lecture. Read about what needs to be covered the day before. And all that information is easily available online. Bookmark your favorite sites, whatever you like. That's called the flipped classroom model. What's the advantage of doing that? Why should you do that? Yeah, so why do you want to get a clear idea? The teacher's going to teach you. Why do you want to waste your time? Wouldn't you rather be partying with your girlfriend? So, this is all the good intentions we all have. My limited point is do it for selfish reasons. We all know that if you're the teacher's pet and if you have all the answers, you're going to get preferential treatment throughout, and therefore create buckets of goodwill. And if the teacher is impressed that this particular student is good, then even if there are times when you're not doing very well, that teacher will stand up for you and bat for you. And it always helps to have that little sweet spot. So again, a lot of this information is available. And along with studying stuff before, the class becomes much more interesting. And again, at the end of it, at the end of the day, just quickly review everything you've done. Because the reality is, all of us forget stuff. But these are simple tools which you can use to make sure that the information is a little stickier and remains. It'll just make life a little more interesting for you. How many more minutes do I have? I think the problem here is everyone's very polite. So even if I continued on and on, no one is going to stand up and say, hey, Dr. Malpani, we're getting bored. We need to have a cup of tea. Not too many slides left, guys. So this is a common problem. Very, very common. And this happens every single day in a pharmacy, in a chemist. What is called look alike, sound alike, which means a doctor writes a particular prescription and it's a confusing drug name, as a result of which the patient ends up taking the wrong, again, multiple things. Of course, doctors are famous for their illegible handwriting. Again, there are 50 different brand names and you have all these I can't remember any of them and I don't even try anymore. But this is what makes the problem even worse. There are all these new products and all MRs want you to prescribe the newest product. because that's obviously the most expensive one. And they all look the same, and the names are similar, and the packaging is the same. So just too much scope for error. Here are real life examples. Honestly, I wouldn't even blame anyone for making, confusing, let's say, gabapentin with gem. Pardon the unpronounceable name, it doesn't really matter, but there is so much scope for making mistakes. Look at these two bottles. Hydralazine is completely different from hydroxyzine. Any patient could easily. Now, when something like this happens, patients get angry and they go to the chemist and shout at the chemist and shout at the doctor, and everyone shouts at everyone else. But this was designed for failure. And that's what I meant about it being systemic. So how do we prevent stuff from this happening? And it's possible to prevent. There could easily be a database electronically of what all the drugs look like, the photos, stuff like that. And tomorrow, before any pharmaceutical companies allowed permission to release a drug in a particular packaging, the authorities could say, no, you're not allowed to do this, or you are allowed to do this, or whatever. Simple solutions is my limited point. So what about the role of doctors? Again, lots of things you can do. And I think a lot of these guidelines have already been laid down. Specify everything in complete thing. Educate your patients. Double check on your brands and names. Please use the generic name. At least that way, you'll reinforce everything you're doing. It's much easier for you. Please write everything in capitals. And I'm sure in a few months, all of this will be irrelevant because everyone will do everything on computers. But the fact remains is that computers run out of batteries all the time. And you still need to be able to write with your hand. And it's a good idea to learn good habits now. But it's not just the doctor. The doctors look like the heroes. All of us like being heroes, but it's often the nurse and the patient, and it's exactly the same thing. These are the people who are the ultimate defenses, and nurses have lots of experience. And I honestly think if you listen to your patient will stop you from making the error if you're respectful enough. Unfortunately, this is what a doctor's life is. Right, sir? Doesn't your office look a little bit like this? I apologize, but the fact of the matter is that sir would much rather be in this classroom teaching you guys, but unfortunately, because he has 50 different administrative duties, the dean is calling up, someone from Delhi is calling up, someone from the Mantralaya is calling up, and he can't focus his energies on what he really loves doing and wants to do, and that's unfortunately sad. As a result of which, most doctors end up wasting a lot of their time on being used as clerks. So, I don't want to end on a down note. I want to end on a high note. And that's where you guys are coming in. How do we get doctors to actually come up with these solutions? We can't depend on politicians to come up with these. We can't depend on engineers. I respect engineers, Krishna, but ultimately the fact of the matter is that we're the ones who are taking care of patients. We are the ones who know what our problems are. We're the ones who need to find the solutions. And unfortunately, this is what doctors end up getting stuck, and it becomes worse. And this is really what we want to hope to do, reinvent medical education. We want you to be able to think. It's not just think what's in your medical textbooks. It's not just think about what you're going to fill up on the stupid MCQ questions. I can guarantee you, if I gave you that same MCQ exam, which you guys filled in and got 99.99% today, how many of you do you think you get 99.99? Be honest. I know for sure if I tried getting into medicine, I'd most probably not get into medicine. And I'm sure if I tried sitting for an MD Gynec exam, I'd most probably fail. Because they ask all kinds of irrelevant questions, and I honestly don't even know why they do, but that's a different thing. But the point is that we need guys like you. You're young, you're intelligent, you're capable of doing anything and everything. And I think you can do this on a much larger scale, and this is what we want. We've done a good job taking care of patients one-on-one. We want you to think like engineers. Doctors are good, and you need to be good. And I'm not saying, when a doctor is doing surgery, you don't want the doctor to be a cowboy and innovate and say, oh, let me try using the stitch with my left hand, or let me try using this material. When you're taking care of that patient, then you do what's right for that patient. But after the operation is over, can you step back and you think, hey, why don't I try doing this? Wouldn't it be better if I did this? And that's the beauty about engineers. You also learn, not just for that individual patient, you also learn what you can do to help 100 other patients. This is where M.I.C.E comes in. Again, it's just a walk away. Guys, in one sense, you're fortunate. You're the only medical college in this country who has something like M.I.C.E labs. So lots of you could very easily have got into IIT, I'm sure. But you had to choose between one and the other. But this way you can have your cake and eat it too. So we'd love for you to come up with these projects. We'd love for you to come up with some of these. And I'm not saying you're going to do all of that, but at least if we change your mindset, if we start empowering you to think, hey, we can come up with these solutions, your professors will respect you a lot more because you understand a lot of this technology, which honestly they don't. And I think that's where some of the magic can occur. If you've forgotten everything I've said, that's absolutely fine. That's our website. It's an easy acronym to remember. It's called thebestmedicalcare.com. Everything I've described, we've written a book. The book is called Patient Safety. It's free on the website. Half the book is for doctors and the other half is for patients, because at the end of the day, everyone needs to work together to make sure that patients are benefited. So, just go through that. And that is my last slide. That's the reason we all became doctors. That's the reason I love getting up in the morning. I always tell people, doctors are happy, we're well off, we do well in everything else. Our financial income is good, no reason to complain. May not be as good as an MBA's or an engineer's, but our emotional income is priceless. Because this is the one profession where people tell you to your face, thank you, Dr. Saab. People say thank you to politicians as long as they're in that kurchi. The moment they leave that kurchi, no one cares about the politician. They say thank you to the policeman because you don't want the policeman to, give you a ticket and stuff like that. But they don't have any respect for that individual human being. For doctors, it's completely different. Guys, you're privileged to be in this room. Please make the most of it. That's my request. Thank you.